Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Gruber Lecture. It is a privilege and a pleasure to welcome Jessica Valenti as our guest of honor, hosted by the Gruber Program for Global Justice and Women's Rights. Jessica, as you know, is one of the most impactful feminist voices of our time, and we are incredibly lucky to have her here. Before I introduce Jessica, I just want to begin by expressing our gratitude to the Gruber Foundation for its unwavering commitment to justice and human rights. Pat Gruber and her husband nurtured a remarkable foundation that has been a visionary force in advancing science and global justice and women's rights. And with her dedication and leadership, Pat has led the foundation to transformative heights, ensuring that its work has a profound impact throughout the world and especially here at Yale Law School. They believed in empowering individuals, so Gruber Fellows are out in force right now pursuing justice and equality across the globe, and they enable us to have these amazing fora like this one. I'm also just deeply grateful to Reva Siegel for support in organizing the event and guiding this essential work forward. I really am also grateful. Where's Mindy Roseman? Just want a huge shout out to Mindy Roseman, director of the Gruber Program for Global Justice and Women's Rights, and Alexander Kopax for all their hard work in putting this event together. So we're gathering tonight to hear from a woman who has deepened our understanding of the critical issues surrounding reproductive rights in the United States. And Jessica, you could not have come at a better time. Jessica has devoted her career to advocating for a distinctive vision of equality. A powerful writer and a dedicated activist, she has been described as, and I quote, one of the most successful and visible feminists of her generation. Her impact extends beyond education, educating the general public. She's encouraged young feminists to turn their intuition into conviction, equipping them with the language and data and insights to pursue their visions. Her first blog, Feministing? I can read it, but I haven't ever heard it said, was a vessel for that vision, a pioneering platform that expanded the reach of feminist discourse, making it accessible to young women in a way that was both relevant and unapologetically bold. At its peak, Feministing reached 1.2 million readers each month, an ensemble of voices that were informed and ignited. And it wasn't just a blog, it was a movement that rippled out, reshaping conversations from living rooms to classrooms, from protest to policy. In the years since, Jessica has continued to break new ground as a feminist writer and advocate, always with the same goal, not to, and I quote, preach to the choir, she puts it, but to arm the choir. Her daily newsletter, Abortion Every Day, captures the countless developments in reproductive rights following the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Through this platform, Jessica unpacks complex legal battles, analyzes political strategies, and amplifies stories that often go overlooked. With each entry, she helps her audience remain informed in a landscape that is filled with rapidly shifting policies, rhetoric, and disinformation. Beyond her daily newsletter, Jessica's public works, including The Purity Myth and Sex Object, have offered important interventions into conversations on gender, sexuality, and autonomy. These books dive into the cultural narratives around women's bodies and rights. Her most recent book, Abortion, Our Bodies, Their Lives, and the Truths We Use to Win, extends the mission, serving as both a chronicle of the current fight for reproductive rights and a guide for those determined to protect them. Now, Jessica has said that her daughter, Layla, serves both as a grounding force and a source of inspiration. For Jessica, every article, every book, every newsletter she creates is part of a legacy meant not just to resonate with her current readers, but with generations to come. She brings her voice to our law school community at a pivotal moment, and we are lucky to have her perspective today. Jessica, as you will notice, will be joined in conversation by our own beloved Reva Siegel, the Nicholas D.B. Katzenbach Professor of Law, and Emily Bazelon of the New York Times, and also a senior research scholar here and the Truman Capote Fellow at Yale Law School. So please join me in welcoming them all to our platform.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Turn this on for you.
Okay, everyone, welcome. So we'd like to get ourselves started. Thank you, Heather, Dean Gerken, for that lovely intro. And we're going to keep our introductions incredibly scant and just say it's great to see everyone here this evening. It's kind of gray, dark, but we've got what we hope is some good energy in the room, and we need it right now. We are going to start not by leaping directly into the election news, but instead starting by focusing on Jessica, and starting really by trying to develop a sense of who she is. I gather if you're here because you know that she's really done an immense amount to focus on the question of women's rights, human rights, and how it intersects with media, new media. And so we're going to try to draw that set of questions out at the beginning of our conversation and mosey our way towards the election as we go. And so I'm going to start by turning this over to Emily.
Thank you. Thank you, Reva. It's great to be here with all of you. Thanks for taking the time to come this afternoon. So, Jessica, you have been a feminist writer and creator and thinker for at least 20 years.
Over 20, yeah.
I didn't want to go past that. And I just wanted to start you out kind of at the beginning of your own arc. So when you created the blog Feministing, which really was, I think, an innovation, the media culture was changing. Social media was just emerging. And I wonder if you could take us back to that time. What were you trying to do then? How did you see yourself fitting into this changing world?
Sure. Feministing was one of the first sort of group feminist blogs. I founded it with a couple of friends back in 2004. And at that point, I had been working with nonprofit feminist organizations, was a young feminist myself, and was feeling very much like the mainstream movement gave a lot of lip service to how important younger women were, but weren't necessarily very interested in hearing what we had to say. It felt like sort of the media coverage that you would see of feminism always relied on the same 3 to 5 voices for quotes. There was just this sort of insular group when it came to feminism, and young feminists were really not a part of it. And so the hope was to create this platform for younger feminist voices that didn't necessarily get a platform elsewhere. And I think because the timing was right with the rest of the political blogosphere, we really lucked out in a way. And because we were a group feminist blog, we were posting just constantly, right? Like there were definitely a lot of feminist blogs, but a lot of them were run by individuals. And so when you have 3 or 4 people and you're writing 10 to 12 posts a day, it really worked in our favor in terms of just something as simple as Google News searches. I remember before starting Feministing doing a Google search for young feminism. And the first thing that came up was a page from Now from 1997, right? Like there was just this lack of information about young feminism and young feminists online. And I think that we were able to sort of fill a gap in a certain way. And I was really happy to do that for quite a while. And then I sort of, you all are probably too young to know Menudo, but I felt like I aged myself out. I was at a certain point, I'm like, okay, this is a platform for younger feminists. And so I left and went on to do other things and left it in some very capable hands.
And along with adding to the number of voices and younger voices, what were you trying to change about the way the issues you cover were presented? Because I feel like you have a really strong sense of that.
Yeah, the hope, I had just gotten out of a master's program in women's and gender studies, and I loved it, and I loved my professors, but it was so heavy on theory. And, my feminism really came from my mother, who didn't graduate high school, and there came a point where the stuff I was learning about feminism and the way I was talking about feminism was not relating to her anymore, and that sort of ceased to be as useful to me. And so it was really important to me to create a space where anyone with any level of education, anyone with any level of activist engagement could come across the website and feel like they recognize something about themselves in it and would feel like they could interact with the issue and feel comfortable engaging and reading and commenting, right, without feeling excluded or weird or out of place. And so, yeah, it was really very much about that, and having accessible language. And of course, like, this became sort of what the feminist blogosphere ended up being about anyway, which was like a more sarcastic, irreverent, playful voice that was, at that time, there was still this idea of feminists, like the man-hating, right? Like that stereotype was out there. And so I think in some ways it was a reaction to that, but also a reclaiming of that. Like, And so what if I do, right? So it was a fun time. It would not be as fun now.
Reva, do you want to?
So if I nudge us forward a lot closer to the present, so we know that, I'm going to move us up to the era of Dobbs. So we know that in the era that the Dobbs opinion leaked, we could be going year by year here, but we know that in the era that the Dobbs opinion leaked, you began to focus a lot of your coverage on it's sort of what was happening in its wake, and you really began to do some innovative new forms of innovation and coverage and build out a kind of almost communal response to the abortion developments in the wake of Dobbs. And I just want to draw you out a little bit of storytelling almost about the development of the Substack Abortion Every Day that I think at least some good number of people in the room here are familiar with. I see heads nodding. So that Substack ends up being the place in which you begin to have bottom-up reporting about what's happening out in the world, that is before it's even covered, when it's not being covered in regular media. And there's a kind of new form of coverage emerging. And I guess I want to just start out by asking, to what extent did you know in advance what you were going to make, or was it sort of emergent?
No, not at all. I did not know a thing. I had an existing Substack where I was writing weekly columns, just general feminist takes. But then when the Dobbs decision was leaked, I think like a lot of people, I was so devastated and so angry, and I had this platform. And so I started, just writing about my feelings about it. And then once Roe was overturned, the consequences were immediate, right? Like immediately we started seeing stories about people bleeding out, bans being passed, just the worst kinds of lawsuits, the worst kinds of medical nightmares, and a lot of anti-abortion strategy that was happening sort of under the cover of darkness and overwhelm. I think so many of us were just completely exhausted, both emotionally and in real life, in our jobs, physically, about everything that was going on. And so I just sort of started to keep track of it all in a daily report for myself at first. I really truly did not think about it becoming a social, I didn't think about it becoming a thing. I was like, there's so much happening. Someone needs to keep track of it. Let's talk about everything I noticed today. Let's get into it.
You weren't initially every day.
No, it was a couple times a week, I think. But there was so much that after a certain amount of days, I was like, oh, I've been doing this every day. Let's just formalize it. Let's change the name of the Substack. Let's call it Abortion Every Day. And it was so clear that there was a need for it, because I was hearing from so many people. I was getting so many more subscribers, like both people who just care about the issue and people who worked within the movement, who were out fighting the good fight and didn't have the time in their day to figure out, okay, well, what lawsuit was brought forward in Wisconsin, and what is the ban that's happening in, there was no place that was sort of compiling everything, and I think compiling everything in a way that was as angry as other people were, right? And so I think one of the things I did sort of unconsciously, but then deliberately later, was channel a lot of the anger that people were feeling and a lot of the frustration. And I think when you're talking about an issue like this, that's so personal to people and that's so infuriating, it's already so hard to have to do this work. It's already so hard to have to read about this every day, to read these horror stories. The least I could do is write it in a way that made people feel seen, that made people feel like, okay, I'm not crazy. This is as horrible as it is. And I think that was incredibly helpful. And in this way, I think that actually the work that I did at Feministing really made this possible, because it does feel very much like blogging to me, right? Even down to the comments section, where there's this really vibrant community of people in comments who are giving each other support or tipping me off to stories. So it feels like going back to that in a way.
It's actually a kind of mixed genre in which you've got elements of community input, intensively fact-based reporting, giving people information that's not anywhere else otherwise available, but at the same time, you're feeling and at this critique too.
Right.
So you're also deciphering the ways that things are being described and relating back to people how they're being misdescribed. So
Right.
there's a lot of things going on there.
There's a lot of decoding, I think,
Yeah.
that's really important to me. There's a lot of decoding of what's happening in the anti-abortion movement, what they're really doing as opposed to what they're saying, and making the connections between strategy, language, policies, where, if you're in one state and you don't know that anti-abortion groups tried this one tactic in Ohio, you may not realize that it's coming for your state next, right? And so I was just also trying to create a through line for people who care about this issue, for people who work on this issue, to be able to see into the future a little bit. I think that it's so necessary for this movement to be able to predict what they're going to do next, because there is so much. It is so overwhelming. Like, such a big part of their strategy is to just hit us with everything all at once. And because you're talking about an issue where lives are literally on the line and people are literally dying, there's so much work being done just on triage, right? Just to literally save people's lives, that it's really, really difficult to think ahead, to think about strategy, to think about being proactive rather than defensive. And so I'm trying to do the best I can to sort of set people up to be able to do that.
I'm just going to ask one more question from a somewhat different perspective. So there was a lot of concern or report of injury, distress in what you were reporting there, but just wanted to get you to reflect a little bit that there was also a sense of community that was emerging out of this.
Yeah.
And just, I guess, retrospectively, in the time period that you were developing the site or the Substack, do you have a sense at all about how conversation about the issue changed, sort of in tone or?
Yeah, I think, we have been on the defensive for so long, especially when you're talking about, I think, legislators. But I think what's been most incredible about this Substack and watching the, abortion rights movement in general is watching us win. And I know it doesn't feel like that right now. I really, really do. But we are winning culturally. We are winning public opinion tremendously, tremendously so. And watching people come to terms with that, watching people be so angry, but also realize that they're not just in the small majority, they're in a vast, incredible majority, I think has been really powerful and energizing for a lot of people. And the conversation has changed in that way. I think that we've seen, and again, it doesn't always feel like that, and there's always stuff that I wish, Democrats would do differently when it comes to the way they talk about abortion. But the way that they're talking about abortion now and the way that the national conversation is about abortion is so incredibly different than it was just a couple of years ago. I don't think that can be overstated. And it's moving us in a really incredibly optimistic direction culturally, right? Like, politically, it's a harder conversation, but that does give me a tremendous amount of hope.
So I want to ask a question that I think gets at, I hope we'll get at your sort of theory of cultural change. So with your Substack, and you also have a book coming out that's out right now, Abortion, Our Bodies, Their Lives, and the Truths We Use to Win. So I think that you've said that you're not trying to reach everyone, that you see your audience in a particular way, and you're often, I think, usefully critical of legacy media for what you see as a kind of both sides presentation, which can give false equivalency to lots of different arguments. It can be something like, do we call a ban, or do we call it a limit, or what was J.D. Vance's term, a
Minimum national standard.
Yeah, something that sounds much softer. There are also a lot of questions about how the media presents evidence about safety and effectiveness. I guess I hope the mainstream media, since I work in it, is doing better on some of those issues, but you might think that that's not the case at all, which is totally interesting to me. So how do you think about your audience, and then how do you feel about its relationship or your kind of sense right now of how you're pushing legacy media and changing some of the ways people talk about these issues?
Yeah, I do often say that I'm not trying to change hearts and minds, right? Because we already have them. 81% of Americans do not want the government involved in decisions about pregnancy and abortion in any way. We have won that battle, and I think to a certain extent, the anti-abortion movement has been really successful in making us believe that we need to spend a lot of energy and time convincing other people to come along with us. I don't think that's a good use of our time. I think this is an issue of a small group of extremist legislators, putting their will on the vast majority of voters. And so I think, when we're spending our time trying to change people's minds who will probably never change their minds, especially when they're in the minority, we're not spending time working on issues of democracy. We're not spending time working on voter intimidation, on gerrymandering, right? And those are the issues I think that are really going to help us in terms of making a tangible change. And so the thing I like to say is, because inevitably someone says, well, don't you feel like you're preaching to the choir? And I say, no, I feel like I'm arming the choir. I'm giving the choir what they need to go out and do the work in their own lives, no matter what that means, whether they're a law student, a lawyer, an activist, someone who is very active in their Facebook community group, who gets the word out there. I think that there's a lot of power in just making people who are already with us feel armed and confident and like they have everything that they need to go out and do the work. I also think about this audience as folks who can help to pressure mainstream legacy media outlets to report on this better. And I think actually minimum national standard is a perfect example of this, where when Vance was announced as Trump's running mate, the New York Times, a couple of other, NPR reported Vance doesn't support a national abortion ban, because they were looking at an interview where he said, I don't support a national abortion ban. I want to give it back to the states. I support some kind of minimum national standard. But a minimum national standard is the same thing as an abortion ban, right? And the reason I know that, one, is because we know he was lying, but two, because of the work I was doing in Abortion Every Day, I knew that the anti-abortion movement had done this very, very specific campaign where they were trying to redefine the word ban. And to them, and what they were telling legislators, politicians, is that abortion ban only refers to a total prohibition on abortion with zero exceptions, even no exceptions for a person's life, in which case that means America has no abortion bans. Texas doesn't have an abortion ban. Tennessee doesn't have an abortion ban, right? But if you're talking about Lindsey Graham's 15-week abortion ban, that's actually a minimum national standard. That's not a ban. And so it's this sort of rhetorical crossing of their fingers behind their back to make voters feel like they are softer or more moderate than they are on abortion. And, I was so frustrated to see sort of this coverage, and because of the community that we had built at the newsletter, and because of who that community is, because they're really influential people in their own right. And when I say influential, I don't mean they're journalists or they're, though some of them are. I mean, they're people who in their own small local communities have sway. We were able to sort of launch a pressure campaign and get corrections in the Times and in NPR. And now, a couple of weeks before the election, when the Times did their coverage of breaking down, okay, what does Trump think about abortion? They asked the campaign, well, what does Trump think about a minimum national standard? He says he would veto a ban, but would he veto a minimum national standard? And of course, his campaign wouldn't answer, and they just reiterated he would veto a ban, right? And so, to me, I see the work as, it's not as much about pointing out gaps as it is just trying to help fill them as much as possible, and trying to help push the coverage to be as complete as possible.
3 days.
It was a couple of days.
I think it was 3 days. Bam, bam, bam.
Yeah,
like that.
But that's how, that's how quickly it operates, right? That's how quickly social media operates. That's how quickly you need to have something like that happen. Otherwise, it's just as out of people's minds, right? And so I think to a certain extent, you really have to have this obsessive quality about it that is not always appealing to everyone, but that does get stuff done.
Well, the language game in this is
Yeah.
half the game, I guess. I mean, even the word abortion, what's an abortion? What's happening under the exceptions? For a lot of people, those aren't abortions.
Right. There's been a huge campaign to redefine abortion not as a medical intervention to end a pregnancy, but an intention, right? So if you didn't want the abortion, if you had to have it because of a medical emergency or even because you were sexually assaulted, that's not really an abortion. That's something completely different. And of course, we know that that's ridiculous.
And counter to the way medical professionals who
Medical
use abortion
professionals-
for
Exactly.
Yeah, sorry.
But they're codifying it, right? Like they're codifying it again and again in this legislation, in state Supreme Court decisions. And the consequence of that is really, you can track it from point A to point B, where in places like Idaho, where they said, you know, it's not an abortion if it's a life-saving procedure, it's a maternal fetal separation, right? I mean, literally, that's what they're calling it. And they have like in my book, I have a whole anti-abortion glossary. It's a maternal fetal separation. And what is so, because sometimes people will ask, well, who cares what they call it, right? Like if they're calling it that, what does it matter so long as the person's getting care? But what ends up happening is that they say, a maternal fetal separation, you can't actually do a traditional abortion procedure in order to keep up this ruse that abortion is never necessary to save someone's health or life.
That's a whole, I mean, that's
Yeah.
a thing.
Yeah, that's a thing.
Abortion. No, I mean, that frame is a thing.
Yeah, that it's never necessary. And so Idaho's Supreme Court has, when they, were doing a little decision about the life-threatening, the exception for life-threatening pregnancies, they wrote into it, well, maternal fetal separation, like inducing vaginal labor or giving someone a C-section. And so what we're seeing in these states are women who are 14 weeks pregnant, 15 weeks pregnant, being forced to undergo, traumatic major abdominal surgeries in order to keep up this lie that you see abortion's never necessary. You can just give her a C-section, right? It's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And again, like the language really does have this trajectory to real life harm to people.
Okay, so, well, all right, so we're going to move from word games to shifting a bit into the direction of lawmaking. So we're now in a phase in which pre-Dobbs, a lot of the legislation was legislation enacted as restrictions by opponents of abortion. Now we're in a world in which, as we've seen, a lot of the lawmaking is by proponents of access. We have seen ballot measures in the immediate aftermath of Dobbs and certainly right up through the presidential election. And these are forms of democracy, direct democracy. Many states, these referenda are happening not through the legislature, but matters of interest to the electorate where the legislature hasn't acted for reasons one way or another. We could go into it, but in any event, citizens are sponsoring these ballot measures often, but not always, to amend their state constitutions. And 26 states allow their citizens to do so. And just by way of background to all of this, Emily and I thought we'd do a scorecard for you. Since Dobbs has sent the question of abortion to the states, abortion rights advocates have scored 13 victories, excluding Florida, where the 57% was not 60%, and their opponents 3. On the other hand, we can put this against the backdrop of Kamala Harris defending abortion rights, losing in the election to Donald Trump, taking credit for overturning Roe. So looking at this whole background, we just wanted to think a bit about the question of abortion and the electoral process. And I'm going to turn this over.
Right, and just to add one more part of this, we have a number of states, Nevada, Arizona, Florida, Montana, where we see people, a majority of people elect Trump and also protect abortion rights through a state ballot measure. So what are you making of these perhaps contradictory or maybe not election results?
I mean, I really am very convinced, and I warned about this in the newsletter before the election, that Trump's rhetoric around giving the issue back to the states, I'm giving this to the will of the people, was very effective and was not called out enough by mainstream outlets. I think, you know, all of his sort of proclamations that he would veto a national ban, those were the headlines, right? While there was no sort of contextualizing about what ban means versus minimum national standard. There was no, very little contextualizing. And I've spoken to so many people since then, and it's so distressing to hear, who didn't know that their state ballot measure could be overwritten by a national ban.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Like there's a lot of people who just did not know
Right.
that, and so felt like
Totally. Of course.
I can support Trump and still protect abortion rights. And I think what Trump was doing was offering something really seductive to Republican women, which was the illusion of having a choice, that he was still going to give them a choice in this. And I think for a lot of them, maybe they were just looking for an excuse anyway to vote for him, right? And I don't want to downplay that or downplay the racism of it. But I do think that I do think that the rhetoric and the success of his rhetoric was a really big thing. And we saw in battleground state polls before the election that these voters had gotten the message on pretty much everything when it came to Project 2025 and like what they knew the consequences of Project 2025 would be, except a national abortion ban. That was the one thing that they didn't understand point A to B. And I really do think that that was in part about the rhetoric. But it does, the ballot measures, that said, like, do give me a lot of hope just in how clear it is, again, that abortion is winning, right? Like even the three losses, Florida, Nebraska, South Dakota, I don't even know that you could call them losses, right?
They all
like,
have an asterisk.
exactly. So Florida, you have 57% of the vote, and that's a loss. And it's 57% of the vote in the face of an incredible state-led campaign against the measure, an illegal
Terrorize, yes.
Yeah, an illegal state campaign. Like, you're not supposed to use the power of the governor's office to campaign against, you're not supposed to use taxpayer dollars to launch a website in opposition to a citizen-led initiative. But they did. And so it was fascism at play for sure, and yet they still got 57% of the vote, right? Voters made themselves very, very clear that they want abortion rights to be restored. In Nebraska, there were two dueling ballot measures where there was one pro-choice one that would protect abortion rights until viability, and I say viability for reasons we can talk about later. And then there was one that would codify the state's 12-week abortion ban. But because anti-abortion lawmakers, organizations saw that pro-choice ballot measures were doing so well, they said, let's launch one of our own. We're going to give it a name that sounds almost identical to the pro-choice one. We're going to send petitioners out and we're going to tell them to approach voters and say, hey, have you signed the pro-choice petition yet? And that's what they did. They went out and told people that they would be signing a pro-choice petition. That's how they got it on the ballot. They used confusing language. I think a lot of voters did not know what they were signing up for. And I said in a conversation earlier today, I do think it's incredibly telling that anti-abortion groups spent almost as much money in Nebraska on this opposition campaign that they did in Florida, right? And the reason for that is because they were looking to see how successful they could be with co-opting pro-choice rhetoric and tricking voters. Because looking forward, they know that abortion rights are incredibly popular, and they know they're not going to be able to just say, yeah, we want to, have bans, we want to ban at 6 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it is, 0 weeks. And so they were trying out how successfully can we trick voters, and the answer was pretty successfully. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming days. I mean, and we've already seen, I could give a million examples, but one of my favorite is that a lot of Republicans started describing bans at like 12 weeks, for example, 12-week ban, as a law to protect abortion until 12 weeks, right? And so you're talking about just like the shifting of language to make it sound as pro-choice as possible, which again is a sign that we're doing so well culturally, but is so disturbing for what it means for us fighting moving forward.
There's a lot that one could say about those votes. One could ask a set of questions about whether it was wise to create the option for the vote, what was accomplished by having the votes, but I think I want to move to the question of how the Trump administration is likely to respond. I mean, none of us knows, but given that expression of, does it make any difference? Just in the universe of, so there's an enormous amount of support that the Republican Party has gotten from anti-abortion groups, and no doubt there will be anti-abortion policy of many flavors put in motion. To what extent do you predict or do you expect the administration to hold back or merely to mask, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think it will be masking, right? I think Comstock is a no-brainer. I think they'll start to enforce Comstock, and it gives them the ability to say, we're not passing a ban, we're just enacting health and safety measures. We want to make sure that these, dangerous drugs are not being trafficked across state lines. Like, they're going to frame it in this very particular way. They're going to use health and safety. Health and safety is going to be the new language. Same thing with IVF, right? Like, all of the IVF regulations and tracking will be health and safety. And then, and I'll let you speak, but I just have to say, and the national ban stuff, right? Like, if they have the votes, if they win the House, if they have the votes for a national ban, I 100% think that they'll push a national ban, and they'll say it's not a ban, it's a minimum national standard, it's a restriction. I think there's a reason that Trump's campaign would never answer the question of, would you veto a minimum national standard? And it's because that is their plan. They're going to, try to pass a 15-week ban and say it's anything but.
I just want to, I can't resist, just make sure that everybody has a sense of how radical, in fact, the Comstock Act enforcement would be, which obviously you are highly aware of.
Lots of ways it could happen, but.
Yes, but we're talking about an 1873 law that was passed in like the Victorian era to mostly prosecute people from sending like nude pictures through the mail, but also at that point said anything that could be used for either contraception or abortion. The abortion provisions have not been enforced for 100 years, but unfortunately are a part that remained on the books despite an effort in the 1990s by the Democrats and Newt Gingrich's Congress to overturn them. So I just want to, it's really, really regressive to imagine this law being enforced, whatever health and safety rhetoric it comes draped in.
Yeah, it's truly bananas. And it is not just, to be clear, it would be, they could enforce it against abortion medication being shipped, and abortion medication is used in 63% of abortions in the US. And so immediately you have this like backdoor informal national ban. It could be used to stop supplies, like abortion supplies and tools. And if you're talking about what Republicans find obscene, you're talking about PrEP, like HIV meds like PrEP. You're talking about gender-affirming hormones. I mean, really, they could use it in all sorts of different ways. So, yeah.
So, so there's two branches in which this can go. I will say, as to the Comstock claim, it is not categorical. So when we've talked the language of ban, any judge could read any number of words in a lot of different directions, but it has never been enforced as a ban, a categorical ban, and it is not one.
Which you're emphasizing to show that it doesn't have that full effect. It shouldn't
Yes.
be read that way.
It is an obscenity law, and it's got lots of moralizing language in the text, which remains. And it's got a bunch of intent standards in it. And so intent for unlawful uses. So in fact, there's a series of tripwires. Those folks who want to use it talk about it. They quote a few words out of a long prolix statute and talk about it like a ban. It's not a ban. It's got many words, and it will be argued over for a long time before whatever it is enforced. I'm only saying that because we have a few minutes now. Long, convoluted conversation, but with the right judges in place, like the judge who enforced it the first time around in the district court and the Fifth Circuit, you can go a long way with that statute.
Yeah.
The new suit that was just filed before the election was brought back to his court, even though it has nothing to do with the state of Texas, and he'll probably take it, that sort of thing. Okay, enough of that for now. Anyway, so just going back to where we were before, I had asked the question, would the Trump administration be at all concerned to protect the expectations of the folks who voted for these restrictions, given that they had confidence in him? And the reason I asked that question is, however misplaced their beliefs were, they went to vote with those beliefs. And the reason I asked that question is, it is possible that, given that they voted with him with certain expectations and the belief that they wanted limits on the carceralization of their health care, that if things start going down this road, you might get a bunch of reactions, just like in the midterms, there are often reactions after a national election. So with this issue, as with immigration, as with health care, as with many other issues, it may be that if they aren't disciplined, they may produce reactions. And given that we're sort of moving towards the end of the hour, the Trump administration's efforts to depict this as something that was already on the books and something they had no responsibility for would strengthen their hand. So if this private suit, which was brought by 3 conservative attorneys general, succeeds in the courts and the Supreme Court enforces the whole thing, that would be helpful to the administration.
And if the backlash comes, Jessica, where do you see the resistance going? Like, what happens at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a lot of room to pressure Trump specifically on this. Like, I do think he felt the burn of popular opinion on abortion, but I think that it is going to depend a lot, both with like Comstock, support for Comstock, and a possible national ban. I think it's going to come down to, in the lead up to him taking office, are we getting the word out in, mainstream media outlets, in Substacks, wherever, what this language really means? Like, is there going to be accountability there? Or if they push a national ban and call it a minimum national standard, are we going to see a bunch of headlines that say they support a minimum national standard and they're not going to propose a ban, right? So I do think that like the pressure will be somewhat dependent on that. There was something else I wanted to say, but it's eluding me. I'll come back to it.
So as you're sort of thinking of your own work going forward, I mean, you're obviously going to be talking about these ideas and the ideas of your book. What's your sort of hope? What would you like to see happen next in the world as you arm the choir?
Oh my God, there's so much. There's so much like big stuff and little stuff. I think I'm going to give like one very specific hope and one broader hope. My broader hope is that people start paying attention to not just sort of like the big attacks that we've all sort of come to know about, right? Like Comstock, like national bans, but are starting to understand some of the attacks that maybe are a little bit more hidden, like restrictions on travel, like the way that schools are being infiltrated with anti-abortion propaganda, not just in sex education, but in science classrooms, about the attacks on privacy and data. Like there are all of these sort of like branches of issues that are related to what's happening that I think are just as important as sort of the big splashy attacks that we hear about quite a lot. And then specifically, I would really love to see people, before Trump takes office, order as much abortion medication as is humanly possible and give it out to as many people as is humanly possible. You know, you can get abortion medication even if you're not pregnant, even if you don't need it right now. You can, it's called advanced provision. There's resources on my website. You can have it just to have on hand, just in case you or someone in your community needs it. Not just because pregnancy is dangerous in this country, and it's important that everyone, you know, has this in their medicine cabinet in the same way that you have Narcan in case someone overdoses in front of you, but because it's an opportunity to throw a wrench in a huge piece of anti-abortion strategy, which is tracking, right? Tracking all of these pills, tracking all of this medication, and we have a couple of months to flood the market with as much abortion medication as possible, and I'm trying to basically talk to every like local and state politician that I can, begging them to, you know, take that stockpile that they got when the mifepristone lawsuit was happening and give it out before that medication expires, and to just get the word out to as many people as possible as individuals and activists and community members that this is something that we can do to protect ourselves and to protect our community in the coming months.
Great.